Gene Roddenberry was given a consultant position, and Harv Bennett became responsible to the studio for the making of the picture.
My first task was to see Star Trek, and that I did. It took me about 3 months, and I ran 76 or 77 series episodes on 16 millimeter in a flickering projection room. It occurred to me, or at least it was the basis of my later work, that it was a trinity, literally a triangle of Kirk at the top, Spock, Bones. That these three men represented the dimensions of the show. Logic from Spock, passion from Bones, and there's Kirk who has to say, we have to do it this way. I accept logic. I myself am passionate. I resolve these conflicts. And so I determined immediately that this had to be a story, too, had to be a story about that trinity.
I've never been afraid.
But you left at the very time mankind needed courage.
We offered the world order.
And Space Seed haunted me because it had flickered off the screen and it said, here is this remarkable performance by a great actor, Ricardo Montalban. He dominated the show, and yet the conflict between him as a super person and the triangle of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy almost defeats the triangle. And yet when they overcome him, he's like Osama bin Laden. Where is he? What do you do with him? And so they decide to exile him to some far place.
Would be interesting, Captain, to return to that world in 100 years and learn what crop had sprung from the seed you planted today.
Yes, Mr. Spock. It would indeed.
And I remember thinking, stop the projector. I got it. We will see him again in this movie.
And so began a series of writing and rewriting. Leonard didn't want to be in the film. I thought he was kidding. I thought, and you know, I know him well, and now I didn't know him so well then, and I thought it was a negotiating ploy. And I'm not so sure. He still insists that it wasn't, that he genuinely didn't want to be in Star Trek again. But I think it was the most glorious negotiating ploy, and I think he got $100 a week more as a result of insisting that he didn't want to be in it. So they were going to kill him off.
Leonard had written a book called I Am Not Spock, which he later revised into I Am. And Leonard was going to be not interested in doing this film. I had worked with Leonard when I was at Universal, so I knew him, respected him. And I came up with a notion, this was in the early stages of the story development with Jack Sowards. And what the development was is, I met with Leonard after a performance of a one-man play he was doing. I said, look, Leonard, I know you don't want to do this, but we need you, and in order to do it...
He said to me, how would you like to have a great death scene?
And his own ears went up, because he's an actor.
And that was the first I heard of this idea.
So Harv Bennett brought me into the office one day, and he said, we got to kill Leonard, we got to kill Spock off. And I had a thought. So I acted it out for Harv in his office. Clear door. Engine room. Me on the other side of the door. Hands to the door. And I fell out of my chair and I brought my hand down. We touched. Couldn't get him out of there. Couldn't be brought out. He was dying. And the two of us, side by side, but separated by permaglass. A very clear, polished clear so we could see him rather than diffusion. If the door had been opaque somewhat, so we couldn't see him through the glass door, through the plastic door, I think it would have been better just to see the outline of him crying. But they insisted on seeing him. I didn't know whether that did the movie any good, but I suppose it did.
So I thought maybe this is appropriate, because certainly this will be the last of the Star Trek movies if they make this one.
Tus trailers, visita mi canal.
And maybe it would be an interesting final curtain for the Spock character to go out in a blaze of glory, so to speak. So I said, let's explore it. Tell me what you have in mind. And he eventually sent me a script, which I received while I was in Israel doing the Woman Called Golda project. And I was not crazy about it. I thought the Spock function in the script was not clear. I thought the death scene was potentially touching. It came early in the movie, and I thought it was perhaps out of place.
I was absolutely buffaloed. Karen Moore was an executive with Paramount Television at that time. And Karen said, I think I know who can help you. She said, he's a friend of mine named Nick Meyer. I said, Nick Meyer? Nick Meyer, 7% Nick Meyer?
I got into Star Trek in a very roundabout fashion. It was a Sunday evening, and I was barbecuing hamburgers. And my friend Karen Moore, who was then an executive at Paramount, was cooking French fries or something, and she said to me, Nicky, if you want to learn how to be a director, you should direct. You shouldn't sit on your rear end in this house holding your breath because you can't get what you want. Now, if my mother had said that to me, I probably would have not paid attention, but there are things that you can hear from friends that you can't hear from. And she went on to say, I have a friend down at Paramount, he's a very gifted guy named Harv Bennett that you would like. And he's been assigned to do the next Star Trek film. Why don't you go and talk to him? And I said, Star Trek, is that the one with the man with pointy ears? And she said, that's the one.
Nicholas is a man of enormous talent and enormous energy. He's a man of great decision. He's a man who walks into a room and says, okay, let's go.
I came back to LA from Israel for a one-week visit where I had a break in the shooting, and for the first time I met Nicholas Meyer, who was to direct the film. I had never met him before. And I walked into Harv Bennett's office and sat down, and I was introduced to Nick, and he said, what do you think of the script? And I said, I'm not pleased with it. I don't like it. And he said, much to my surprise and relief, I agree with you. I thought, well, that's a very refreshing kind of comment coming from people who are about to make a movie.
And I said, why don't we make a list? It could be a character, it could be a scene, it could be a plot, could be a subplot, anything. All of it. Could be a line of dialogue.
He said, I'm doing a rewrite. When do you go back to Israel? And I said, I don't know, about 5 days hence, whatever it was. He said, I think I'll have it ready in time so you can read it on the plane going back.
And I was young, and somebody said, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And I said, oh, I can do this in 12 days.
Well, I was really impressed. And that's the way it went. I did get a rewrite, and I did read it on the plane going back to Israel, and it was a much improved script.
Well, nobody rewrites in a couple of days. Nobody in Hollywood does. Well, Nick did. Nick sat down and reformed some of the story, and I thought it was terrific.
Jim, what the hell is the matter with you? Other people have birthdays. Why are we treating yours like a funeral?
Bones, I don't want to be lectured.
The age factor affects Bill Shatner a lot because he's a lot older than I am. It's not a problem for me.
I, of course, felt that with a lot of powder and a very thick base of cosmetics could preserve the fact that I hadn't aged. I felt I carried it off. A lot of people didn't feel that way, but and lipstick's very important to avoid the aging process.
And I don't know that Bill wanted so much to be 50 years old to the world. So I started talking. I don't even remember exactly how it came about. I said, we have watched people age, our favorite movie stars age from being in their 20s to being in their 80s, and some of those great stars did it with great grace, and others didn't. And, you know, there's one example I can think of, because it just popped into my mind. I said, of an actor who aged so gracefully over the decades that his aging became part of who he was. And you are his likely successor. You remind me of him. It was a true statement. It wasn't a con. I really did believe that. He said, well, who? I said, Spencer Tracy. He said, well. A year later, I realized that I had seen Judgment at Nuremberg when it first came out. It was Bill Shatner's first, possibly earliest Hollywood movie role. He was dynamically young, and he was the aide to Spencer Tracy. And you could tell from that performance that he was like, oh my God, I'm on a stage with Spencer Tracy.
The beauty of Star Trek II was the fact that we tried to go back to the original series and the depth and the heart and the character of the original series. So when somebody suggested my son is there, and therefore my wife or my ex-wife or the mother of the son, I don't recall whether I married her or not, it only added to the texture of the story. And to have my son captured and my son killed, and well, it was great stuff. And then never to see Khan. I never saw Khan, but that's another story.
We got in a very precarious situation. We started writing the script. We're going to get Ricardo, but nobody had ever bothered to say, Ricardo, would you like to do this movie with us? And we were getting pretty close to a green light when I remember we said, we better check and see if Fantasy Island and other things will permit him to do this.
I was finishing the 6th season of Fantasy Island, in which I had been a very control man, you know, guiding everybody through the island in total control, you know. Never show emotion.
Tus trailers, visita mi canal.
And I read the script, and I thought, well, it'd be interesting, but the part is, I don't know, after 6 years of doing a television series, I thought I wanted to do something, a part that had a little more size, let's say. But then I read it, and I thought, well, wait a minute, when I'm not on the screen, they're always talking about me, so the part will seem more important. Anyway, I became intrigued by it, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. It'd be fun to do. And I started looking at the script and beginning to study the character, which I knew from the past, but nevertheless, I thought, well, I'll articulate a little bit some of the scene, and I started saying the dialogue, and I said, my Lord, I sound just like Mr. Rourke in Fantasy Island. The audiences are going to laugh at me. This is going to be a disaster for me. What can I do? And I was already committed to it. And so I asked to be sent a tape of the original Space Seed, and I ran it. And I ran it again, and about the third or fourth time, I started to remember what I was trying to do as an actor then. And pretty soon, this character started to sort of take life inside of me. And I thought the only difference is that then, I was then, and today, where is this character? Well, he's been abandoned in a planet where everything went wrong, and his wife, whom he loved passionately, dies this horrible death with little animals that go in her ear. And the one obsession he has now is to get revenge against Kirk, whom he blames for death. So I thought that was an interesting character. And then I started reading, and this time I articulated, and to my satisfaction, at least, I didn't sound like Mr. Rourke at all. I started getting the essence of the character that I had originally done.
You still remember
I cannot help but be touched. I, of course, remember you.
What is the meaning of this attack?
It is ironic that in this great confrontation between these two titan icons, or iconic titans, that Kirk and Khan, with their K-alike names, one syllable, all starting with K, don't ask me why, that they never actually play a scene together. And that was certainly tough.
Con bloodsucker. You're gonna have to do your own dirty work now. Do you hear me? Do you?
Kirk was in a different ship, and I was in this ship. Never the twain shall meet, and therefore I could never have a conversation with him. What happened was that I was doing my scenes, with passion, talking to a wall, literally the wall of the studio, because he wasn't there. And the lines were coming back to me from the script girl, who was one of the sweetest persons I've ever met in my life. But she was not really an actress, nor should she be. So I was giving these lines, about Kirk, you. And the line would come from this little sweet voice saying, well, but I don't. Yes, you do. No, but I really. And I tell you, it was singly one of the most difficult things I ever had to do in my life. To maintain this character, having a response from somebody that was not Captain Kirk, then Captain Kirk. And so that was the difference. In the first one, I felt more at ease talking to him and enjoying the rapport and the dueling with words and so forth. In this case, it was very difficult reacting to the script girl's voice.
And I should also say, while we are discussing Ricardo Montalban, that is his chest. That is the question I am most often asked about Star Trek II, the chest of the Wrath of Khan. And they ask if that's his chest, and it is his chest.
The original ending of the picture was grimmer, more final. It said Spock is dead. The picture ended over the feelings of Kirk in that wonderful moment when he says, of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most human. That's how we were leaving the picture. The preview audience was aghast. There was silence in the theater. And what have I done? Crept into my mind. What have we all done? And people walked slowly out. It was leaving a funeral. So we had a couple of meetings, and we said, it's a great ending, it's a dramatic ending, but it's a downer of the worst sort, and it may end the franchise. There may not be another Star Trek. Nicholas was very properly adamant that this was what we had written and this is what we should film.
I began to have second thoughts about the death of Spock. I had, as I said earlier, bought into it because I thought this will be the last of the Star Trek movies for sure, and which goes to the issue of whether or not I have precognition. The answer is no, I don't. I'm sometimes pretty good instinctively, but in this case, no one could foretell that we were going to do a whole bunch of movies. So when we began to make the film, and I began to realize that we had the kind of energy and we had the kind of chemistry amongst the cast and the storytelling opportunity that we used to have when we were making good Star Trek episodes, I began to wonder if indeed there might not be a future for Star Trek. And here I was committed to leaving it. So, because I committed to leaving it based on the notion or on the perception that this was going to be the last film. And now here we are making a film that promises a future for Star Trek rather than an end. So I began to be concerned about that.
That obviously sparked in me, should I kill him now that he's having a good time? Should I kill him? Is that fair? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But I don't think his enthusiasm
Quitus
went that
tráilers.
far as to say,
Visita
so
mi
let's do
canal.
another one, okay? Don't kill me. He didn't say that. But I began to think it was a smart idea to preserve some future appearance by Spock in some way. I didn't know what way.
The day we did the death scene was extremely sensitive for me. I think for others too, but certainly for me. I remember vividly, just as we were about to shoot Spock going into the chamber, Scotty is, I believe, unconscious. McCoy tries to stop me. I neck pinch him, and he collapses to the floor. Harv Bennett came to me and said, at that moment, before we shot that particular piece of business, what could you do to leave a thread for the future? I thought, maybe he's thinking what I am, that there may be another movie. And I understood that immediately, because as I said, I felt that we were making a film that might lead to other films. So I said, let me do this, and I did a mind meld on the unconscious McCoy, where I simply said, remember. Now that was vague enough to open a door for any other kind of story. Remember meaning what? You could develop a story out of that moment. I thought it might be a useful hinge to an open door to get into another story.
I said, great. It's perfect. And I didn't say it because I immediately said, that's it, and we'll remember. You remember. I just knew that that was the right tonality.
Live long and prosper.
My theory about the coffin and Leonard Nimoy whispering something into McCoy's ear, which were the two things that, that looking back suggests that Spock might come back. Those two things had such calculation. Those two guys, Nimoy and Bennett, were in collusion. There's no question. And they kept me out of it. And to this day, I resent it. They knew. And the terrible thing is, neither Bennett nor Nimoy to this day will admit it, that they knew what they were doing. And when I saw the coffin and I saw Spock go like this to McCoy's ear, extraneous business. See, in a film, every shot has to count, every moment. You don't, especially when you're going towards the end, you don't have any extraneous moments or time. Everything's to tell the story. What was that all about? What was the coffin all about? Unless Nimoy expected to come back. We all mourned him. I hugged him, and I sobbed, and Leonard, you're not... He took me over the coals, that guy. And to this day, he won't admit it. They knew.
I'm sure you'll make him pay.
Oh, I am going to get him one day.
And what we did then was to modify the ending by adding one word, hope. We had ended the picture without hope. We now needed to restore, certainly in a science fiction context, the possibilities. And I remember taking the theme for that from Spock's oft-repeated lines in all the episodes I had seen. There are always possibilities. And it became the theme of what we did in the reshoots. Not a lot. We shot the last scene, and the last scene was rewritten to reflect life from death. And then ILM shot that remarkable sequence of the landed coffin.
It's very, very beautifully done, and James Horner wrote beautiful music to go with it. And that's the shot where you go onto the Genesis planet and you see Spock's coffin lying there. It's the sequel setup. And me, being such a flat-footed, unimaginative fellow, said, "He's dead, Jim. I don't see how you can bring him back, but shows you what I know, where all that popcorn was at stake."
It was at that point that we decided okay, let's really go for it and have Leonard do the prologue. So there was no prologue in Star Trek II, Space, The Final Frontier, because we decided in post-production to save it for the end and let Spock's voice, for the first time in Star Trek's history, read it. Okay.
Tráilers.
I think the final argument was that was too much, folks. That was too much. If you do that, they know you're going to bring him back. And those of us who were for that said, yeah, so?
Space, the final frontier.
We ran the picture for a preview audience with the revised ending. The audience rose as one, tears in their eyes and applause on their hands. And I felt like I felt like all of us had done something right and noble. And I know that's corny, but I walked out of the theater that night saying, yeah, that's the way it should be. I remember that after the picture was released, one of the most respected critics of that day, and still, Janet Maslin of the New York Times, began her review of Star Trek II with the sentence, "Well, that's more like it."
Science fiction is a field practically, or there's nothing quite like it, because suddenly you're taking materials of today and trying to make them look like not only materials of the future, but fantasy materials of the future. A dictum that Gene first put out back when we started the series. All the technology had to look like everyday stuff. No matter how fantastic, it had to look like a screwdriver. It had to be used like a screwdriver. So hence, beam me up, Scotty. I mean, no big deal. And this is one of the things that gave Star Trek its style, in that it was the first time science fiction wasn't some kind of magic. The idea was that it was a technology, that it wasn't, and it works. It works very well. So, for science fiction, you establish a framework, you establish the rules. Now you got to be honest in those rules. You can't just do anything you want to because it's science fiction. Otherwise, it doesn't become particularly believable.
Nick Meyer was a very intellectual man who was extremely fond of opera. And he knew that I had designed a number of operas. Operas tend to be very full-blown and non-realistic and melodramatic and so on and so forth. I think that's very true of the rest, except if nobody sang.
I had the most fun I've ever had working with Nick on this show because he had all the right instincts. He didn't know beans about science fiction.
What Star Trek was, to me, what I got out of it, it resembled a series of books that I had adored as a kid called The Adventures of Captain Horatio Hornblower by a guy named C.S. Forrester. He's the same guy who wrote The African Queen, also Sink the Bismarck. And Captain Horatio Hornblower was a Napoleonic sea captain in the British Navy, had many adventures, sailed to many places, met all sorts of people, engaged in all sorts of battle. And I said, well, Kirk is just Hornblower in outer space, isn't he? So I'll just pretend that he's not in outer space, and then I know how to do this.
For instance, he wanted a dogfight between two spaceships. No, I'm sorry. That's a violation of your frame of reference, because we know that the distances involved are astronomical, the speeds are incredible, the time frame is all wrong. But Nick was right. What Star Trek really wanted was a dogfight between two spaceships. So this is where Mike Miner and I came up with the idea, let's stage the final confrontation in a nebula. And now we can see Enterprise come up behind the other ship and pow, and they can play hide and seek through this nebula, and I think it was quite successful. But this is what I say, let's be honest within our framework, see?
So I changed everything about the look of Star Trek that I could afford to change to be like the Navy. So, and the nomenclature and the dialogue was all sort of Navy-related stuff. And that sort of has stayed to this day pretty much. There was some of it in the original series, but I really laid it on with a trowel. Very nautical. As my wife said, nautical but nice.
Permission to come aboard, Captain.
Welcome, Admiral. Think you know my trainee crew?
The first few weeks that I was on the picture, I had been in aerospace working for Rockwell just prior to that, and then I'd gotten a call while I was off to come over and help Paramount as kind of an illustrator space consultant. And so I was kind of groping. It was my first day in show business. I was working with Joe Jennings because he had been the original set designer on the TV series, and he was heavily a Navy man. So he had dredged up all his memories of what he had done in the Navy, and so as I started designing the furniture of the console and all the panels and what was on the monitor screens, we were wondering about the terminology, what it should be, and he says, well, I can sure tell you Navy terminology, so.
Star Wars had come out in the meantime, and it was extremely successful, and it was very well done. But they had a very jumbly look to their ships, and all of our people, the new people that had come in and were now doing the show, said, oh, we got to do that or we can't show scale. Got to have that detail so that then when we move in on it, you can't show unless there's something going by the camera. And I'm having a knockdown, drag-out fight saying, look, Star Trek has always been the Chris Kraft of science fiction. Also, if you're going to tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood, she can't be accosted by a goose. It's got to be a wolf, and this is what the wolf looks like in Star Trek. So you can't change it now. It's become part of the lexicon. And so you have to keep the slick, streamlined look.
Yeah, it's the Reliant that is the Enterprise upside down and miniaturized.
They had done a nice little rough sketch of what this Reliant ship would look like, and we sent it off to Israel, where Harve Bennett was making a movie about the life of Golda Meir. He took the envelope and pulled it out, and he pulled it out upside down and looked at this ship we had designed, and he said, well, okay. So he signed off on the bottom, this looks fine to me, and he sent it back, and we got the package back and opened it, and he had signed it upside down. So we spent about a half hour debating if we would send it back and say, please turn this right side up. And finally, Joe Jennings and Mike Miner said, you know, I don't think there's time to send it back to Israel and get it back here. Lee, why don't you see what you can do? Just take this upside down and make a ship out of it. Turned out rather well. We made it work.
But we kept the saucer, all right? That puts it in the same Navy. It's the same technology, different ship. You look at a Navy ship, you look at a destroyer, you look at a cruiser, you know they're American vessels and belong to the same Navy because they look alike in a lot of ways. So this was the thing we had to do there and still keep a different look so that you could readily tell one vessel from the other when you saw them.
Nick wanted something a little warmer, more military, less modernistic, or whatever word you might apply to the design of the first one. I went off to my tent and made new sketches, which were read and in a lot of different pieces with many more emblems and badges.
And I confess I'm confused. We're going a little far here. The Star Trek folks are not going to like this Napoleonic, Teutonic kind of look. But as history shows, that became the look not only for the next pictures, but for the next generation and generations yet to come.
When I first came in, there was no coherent schedule of ranks. You know, when you go into the Army or the Air Force or the Navy, you can buy a booklet or you find a booklet that illustrates all of the known ranks, their various divisions, the way the Army of the first is organized and the colors that are used and so on and so forth. There was nothing really set about Star Trek. So I proceeded to write my own little manual, choosing the various symbols for the ranks and the badges. And it became a kind of game. It was fun to do. And I got questions would come from the Trekkies about what did this mean and what did that mean. So I invent it or make it up right away as if it was something that had been handed down to me. Well, it hadn't been handed down to me. I simply made it up. Gene Roddenberry was much more of a dreamer and a theoretician. He didn't like to get too closely connected to the nitty-gritty details about what anything means. Or, in fact, he objected to too much militarism. And when I put more of it in, I don't think he was particularly pleased. I was really doing it for the directors rather than for him.
A science fiction designer can work himself right out of business because directors like lots of things to do. They like switches to pull and buttons to punch and things to go around. Spaceships don't look like that. They're all slick and smooth, and they don't do very much, you know. But you got to have some kind of action.
I remember early on when I was designing for Spock, I noticed they were always, from the TV series, they were never looking at their consoles. They were always looking to the camera and saying very serious lines, but somehow working this equipment. And I thought, how can they do that without ever looking at their instruments? And I remembered I was a little kid. Oh, it was so horrible. I used to wake up my parents early in the morning playing my accordion, the Good Morning Waltz. It's lucky I lived to adulthood when I think about it. But I remember I never had to look at my left hand playing the accordion. And that's because there was one key that had a little indentation in it, the middle C key. So on Spock's console, I made like a triple accordion or quadruple, 4 panels of accordion buttons. And I told the special effects guy, now make one red button or indented button in the middle where that middle C key would be so you can get your position of where you are. And then he can talk and look wherever he wants, but he can use these accordion button instruments. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And it worked. He could do this keyboard without looking.
Khan has been marooned back in the old series days on this planet that has an ongoing, never-ending sandstorm. And this is where they find him. The location department wasn't a bit of help. They didn't have any 5,000-year-old sandstorms going anywhere. So there wasn't anything to do but just needed to be a whole stage. It was not the biggest one we had, but the set covered the entire stage. And transportation pods in which Khan and his friends had been marooned would be in the bottom of a sheltered hole. You didn't need much of a blacking. We just draped out the entire stage in black, then built this well covered in about 8 or 10 inches of sand with bumps and humps and styrofoam rocks that looked as though they had been abraded over the years. And then Bobby Dawson, our specs man, corralled every Ritter fan in town. He had 6 big 6-blade Ritters across the back of the stage. The most miserable place to work in. The sand was just flying so thick you could hardly, they'd have to shut the Ritters down on the dialogue scenes because you couldn't hear yourself think. And the blowing sand in your eyes, and it was just awful. But it worked. And but that was the only thing I knew to do, is just build a sandstorm.
I thought about their predicament, that they had been cast away on this planet with no infrastructure, and the only source of clothing and tools and everything was the ship that they cannibalized. And so when I made a choice of something, I tried to make it as if it had been formerly a part of the ship, or upholstery or something that they had ripped out, or things that they had woven or made out of electronic gear or wiring, or so on. That was the source of the Bedouin mask that Khan first appeared in.
The first scene, I was supposed to come from this god-awful wind outside. And this door opens, and I appear, you know, with this mask and all that stuff. I appear, and I'm supposed to walk to a certain spot that was marked, you see, on the floor. Now, I couldn't see very well. There was little tiny slits in the mask. Then you can't take the mask and go, you know, it got to be done with a certain, because this character, as I say, was, you know, almost superhuman, so he has in great control of his movements, and I remember taking the thing with, again, with rhythm, so that he's revealed, you say. If you fumble, if it's something, you would lose the effect. And of course, that did tell a great deal about the character, a man in command at all times. No mask is going to get in his way, no, nothing. That's what I try to achieve.
That is the best compliment I can ever receive from an actor. And I have occasionally gotten it. Somebody said, I didn't know what I was playing. I didn't know what my character was until I put on the clothes. Thank you. So then I had, of course, the opposite reaction, which is not pleasant. But
we wanted to give Khan some power, some weapon which could destroy the universe to up the odds of the conflict.
And Mike Miner had just been reading in some scientific magazines about terraforming. And he said, well, how about something more peaceful where they fire things at the planet, but it has a peaceful effect, and they do terraforming, and they create a garden planet. William Shatner jumped up and gave him a hug, and he says, now that's the old Star Trek, a bit of science here. So.
And then we had to devise a system for Khan to set off the torpedo. It had to be a piece of scenery now that has its own build to its action, to where, so I just sat down and designed a whole series of lighting effects to go inside of a translucent tube, and we had a blinker off the top of a helicopter that the white light, that bright white light, that it's incredibly bright. I mean, it is just eye-blinding bright. And so that was the tag we established in there. When that went off, it just blew out everything that was on film right there, and you cut outside and kaboom, and the whole thing goes. I was the first man that ever designed a photon torpedo, because as you know, we bury Mr. Spock, which I will take credit for. They said, what are we going to do? We were making a big thing about, are they going to kill Spock or aren't they going to kill Spock? And it was kept a big secret. So they decided that they had to have the funeral. I said, okay, how are they going to get rid of him? You know, I said, if he was a sailor, they'd put him in a sea bag with a shot and throw him overboard. So why don't we put him in a photon torpedo and fire him into orbit around the sun? So they said, hey, that's a great idea. Now I'm stuck. I got to design a photon torpedo, you know. Then I had to have a photon torpedo room where they launch these things from, see? Incidentally, we see it originally, as I recall, in a fight between the two ships, and the torpedo room is holed, and they nearly does them in. Dear Nick says, call the quarters, man the guns, roll them out, ram the shot home, I want action. So what are you going to do with that? You would never see that torpedo in all probability. It would simply be launched directly from its storage site. in real reality. Okay, now I'm trying to be honest to my framework. And Nick wants this long alley that it has to travel down. Well, I had to cover this thing with a grating, and it just hurt me something awful. But Nick was right, it worked. They're all there with hooks, pulling these gratings out so that the torpedo could come through. And this is about as science fiction as my Aunt Fanny's girdle, you know.
As a product of television, I knew how to recycle, reuse, make do, and improvise. So the first thing we did is to try to design a story that could be told in fewer sets, in reusable sets, and it then became possible to use what was left from Star Trek I.
These motion picture people were used to just throwing it in the dumpster, and that would be it, just clean off the stage for the next movie coming in. And I ran in there and said, wait, I think we can take out these electronics and save them and put them in a box. So I was running around helping everybody take stuff out and put it in a box, and I made sure we recycled everything we could.
We built a bridge, and that bridge became the shooting site for approximately 65% of the movie. You don't realize that when you're watching the movie, but we are very frequently in that set. Or it's redress. Redress, if you're not familiar with motion picture terms, is to take one set, modify it slightly, and use it for another purpose. Okay? Well, there's a couple of ships in there, and there's a couple of bridges. And sometimes you're going back and forth between Khan and Kirk, and they're in the same set, folks.
There's one fiberglass, what we call a skin, which is a sheet that you can put up a lot of them and make a wall out of it, you know, but it gives you a texture or something. I was looking for a texture on a wall that would be interesting to light. And Paramount uses, I don't know how many thousands of fluorescent tubes in any given day, but they ship them in by the ton. And when you ship these long fluorescent tubes, they come in a box with a little papier-mâché squares that have ridges, and they sit in the ridges. And then the next layer goes on top. And here were all of these marvelous little pieces of papier-mâché that were grooves on one side. If you turned it one way, you turned it over, it was a series of ridges, you know, and then they had little squares across the ends to give them rigidity. It was an interesting looking shape. So we went all over the lot, collected up a whole pile of these things.
The conventionalists in motion pictures looked at us like the desert scavengers, you know. They were the guys who were having some kind of a scavenger hunt on their lot. And we don't do it this way. We take weeks to build these, and we said, no, we don't need that. We just need it to look right.
We put them all together in a sheet so that you had these ridges, and we made a plastic mold out of it and cast it in fiberglass. And then we turned it over and cast the other side. That's a skin that's still being used to this day. When I was a little boy and other little boys wanted to be a fireman, I wanted to be an actor. And then I grew up and found out that I wasn't much shakes as an actor. So I thought, well, it'd be nice to be a director. I'd be interested in that. So then I found out they'd pay me more money to design scenery than they would to direct. And what the heck? Somebody's got to say, where's the door and where's the window, and the art director gets the first crack at it. And if you can second guess a director enough to put it in the right place the first time, you're that far ahead of the game.